Hi, Paul here from Spitfire Audio. I'm joined by Lauren. Congratulations. It's great to have you here. I haven't seen any of your questions, so I'm entirely unprepared, but I'm really excited to see what is going to be interesting and what's going to be useful to you.
Obviously, you've been very successful both in composing and Spitfire, and as lots of people know, the highs can be really high in composing, but the lows can also be really low. So was there ever a moment where you really just wanted to give it up and it was too difficult? And clearly you haven't, because you're still here. So what kept you going?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I've always kind of pivoted at a point when I might have thought about giving up. So one kind of really difficult moment was round about 2006. There was a point at which I was working on a pitch for it was a car commercial. It was a global commercial, so it was a really important job to me. And I knew that there was another music company pitching for it. And then there had grown up this kind of independent music producer thing in London. So lots of people working, contacts in the ad industry and getting composers to write demos for them for nothing. Whereas, when you were commissioned by an ad agency, you get paid for the demo. With these independent producers, it was just like a cattle call. And while I was working on this job, I got called by, I think it was 5 of these independent companies saying, do you want to pitch on this job? The job that I was currently working on. And I just kind of had this sense that this was a big change in the advertising industry. And it became a lot more uncertain. So it was at that point that instead Spitfire became a thing where it was like a bespoke library for A-list film composers instead. So there was, instead of going to a large group of people, we had a small group of people like John Powell, Harry Gregson Williams, Anne Dudley, David Arnold, and then Hans. At that point, I kind of went from being a full-time composer to being a very part-time composer and almost full-time sample developer. And I basically edited I worked through the entire orchestra and edited, produced the sessions, edited the whole thing myself. I guess that could have been a moment when I'd kind of gone, I need to look for something else because, this is becoming unsustainable as a commercial, life. But my detour of trying to find a way of recording a sample library to get better work kind of accidentally turned into a new career.
What I really like about Spitfire is the recognition that in the sampling process that supposed imperfections aren't really that. They're a huge part of the character and the life of the instrument, so you actually want to include those. So to use that as an analogy, in your life, what's a happy mistake or supposed imperfection that actually resulted in something much better?
I guess it's kind of, you're looking for the way that an accident can become something new or the core of a new idea. And I think composition's a bit like that for me as well. So actually I was talking to Eric Whittaker a couple of days ago, and he said that his second piece, the chord that he settled on as his golden bricks, that's the thing that he always goes back to, it happened because his finger slipped on the keyboard and he was like, oh my God, that sounds incredible. And so he worked out what he'd done wrong. And that was then the whole harmonic language of this piece of music. So it's the balance of the, it's trying to maintain your creativity. There's an interesting way of approaching this. It's actually somebody on YouTube who's more of a kind of business coach, but they have an interesting way of approaching how they allocate their time. And they recognize that people's time can be split into 2 halves. There's a kind of, when you're making stuff, that kind of mindset. And then there's your kind of management, paperwork, admin time. Now, the thing that I think is useful to take from that is that you have to try and block out your time in a way that you don't break up your creative time really in a damaging way by putting something that's the opposite brain function right in the middle of it. So I work well in short bursts. And once I get past a certain thing, if I feel like I'm losing it, I have to just switch focus and do something else. but I'll try and keep that focus in a creative way. So it'll be, right, let me wire something up so that I've got something to use, an instrument to use. So I'm using a slightly different part of my brain, but I'm staying in the same focus. I won't kind of switch and go, right, now I'm going to get on a spreadsheet in the middle of writing something, because it's like, that's going to destroy your flow.
And I know Spitfires, they say their mission is to inspire a generation of composers. I myself have benefited from it, so thank you. But what's your source of inspiration generally when you compose?
That's a really, really good question. Oh, that's actually the essential question. I think that all the music that you listen to and have ever listened to and loved becomes some kind of connection in your brain. And so when you're trying to conjure up melody, harmonic ideas, things like that, that's the kind of fertilizer for that stuff, I think. And I think that is why people have such distinctive voices. The thing that they love is different. All the music they're constantly listening to. So their ideas of where things can go is going to be informed by that kind of music and structure and style. And then this approach to solving problems is entirely different. And I think that's the kind of thing. Now, in terms of, for me, I've got quite an eclectic musical taste, but there's stuff that I was a cathedral chorister for 4 years. So, I was a reasonably good pianist. I was probably about grade 6 or 7, I guess, around about then. But my singing ability for that brief period of time, until my voice broke when I lost it altogether, my singing ability then was way outstripped my ability on any instrument. So I was singing incredibly complex music every day, rehearsing for hours and hours every single day. And that musical education, that kind of embedding of stuff in my head of that specific style, has remained with me, to the extent that I quite often listen to music that I used to sing for pleasure. So everything from, I'm going to contradict myself, of course, everything from Palestrina, but through to the real stuff that I love is the kind of 20th century, maybe the first half of the 20th century, that musical style, which might go from Vaughan Williams to Herbert Howells. There's a really interesting period of music, some secular and some sacred, where the composers became increasingly influenced by folk music and jazz. And so those influences have blended into the choral tradition of Finzi and people like that. And you end up with this really interesting kind of type of music.
So that's what inspires you. But especially when you're working as a composer, you can't rely on inspiration because you've just got to compose all the time.
Yeah.
So what uninspires you or drains your creativity, and how do you bounce back from that?
There's a couple of things. So there's the struggle is when you're writing music to brief, is that the job is not writing, the job is rewriting. You're constantly having to rewrite stuff. And that is a very, very hard mountain to get over at the beginning of your career, because you instinctively think, and I still instinctively think, that when you've written something, that's the way it should go. Especially when it's to picture, or it's a bit easier when you're writing. If you're writing things like in-game music, adaptive music, and stuff like that, where there's not a strict, you've got an idea of the environment and maybe even some of the action, but you're not writing specifically to picture. Once you've written to picture, you've watched and heard your music and that picture so many times that you have all the terrible things, temp love, because you've fallen in love with the way your music works. It's your music, it's your cue, so that's how you designed it, that was your instinctive reaction. And then being told that that's wrong can be enormously disheartening and kind of crush you. And then another one is, there's a part of the process I find of getting through is being able to push through your uncertainty when you're in the process of writing. I'll often find that as I'm working through a piece, I'm constantly thinking, this is rubbish, I should just start again. And the question is it rubbish? Or do you just need to keep going until it sounds good? because you're fighting two things. There's your creative self, which is going, right, I'm building something here, I'm constructing something. And then there's your producer, your kind of music production self that's listening to what is coming out and going, oh, that sounds terrible. What are you doing? So there's a real element of making the most of what you've got.
Would you say your approach has stayed the same across the years, or has it changed? And if it has, how has it changed?
It has changed. I've got better, I hope. But it has changed because as I've got more experience, I've approached things in a slightly different way. And you're always trying to run multiple paths. So you're trying to satisfy as a part of a creative team. We forget that at our peril, that we're actually just one of the creatives working on a group effort that is guided by the direction of usually a single person whose creative vision is the whole thing. So you're subservient to that, but you're also trying to satisfy your own creative urge as well, and trying to do something that's hasn't been done before. So I guess there's a whole element of that which I've kind of developed over the years and has changed in me. But it's also knowing as well when to embrace the cliche, and by that I don't mean writing cliched music, but I mean there are times when you can approach an action scene with really atonal, bizarre kind of ambient music, and there are times when you can approach a love scene with something really jarring and aggressive and kind of and so what I'm saying is there are times when that's completely wrong and you just need to go with the real thing, because at the end of the day we're trying to help tell stories and trying to communicate to people, and if you go too far off piste, then you're ruining the experience for the audience.
Lots of composers really think about samples as just a tool, a final product which they can use. But you're in a very unique position where you've been not only involved in the making of them, but you also use them in your own work. So how has that impacted your composing, and how does it feed back into your own music?
Hugely is the answer. So even back at the very beginning, recording what came to be called the Bespoke Orchestra, which was this little private collection of samples, there were things that are recorded specifically because I had always wanted to use this thing in my own music and never been able to because nobody had ever recorded it. I wanted a playable effect, for example, of the strings, each of the sections separately, so I could control it, but the strings doing this kind of aleatoric, I called it chatter, but just kind of playing different notes like that while bowing like that, and then different volumes, so I could kind of craft these clouds coming and going. And so that's one example. When I was playing a melody, I wanted to hear like the players reaching for the note. So I plotted a course through the notes. As long as the start of the note was close enough, I didn't have the money to, do multiple takes. So I thought, right, I'm going to make a benefit of it, and then it will sound kind of like they're tuning into the notes as they start each new note, and it will help. And it did. It sounded great. You can't do that on commercial sample development because it's too imperfect. It worked for that small group of people where they'd write around the imperfections, or like Simon Franklin says that there's a spiccato in the cellos, I think, where someone clunks the chair leg with their foot or something as the note's happening. And he says that's one of my favorite samples. I use it on everything because it's like I can hear people, I can hear players. But the majority don't want that. They want something that is more refined. They can use on any kind of different, you want to be able to play any tune, the tune that you want. You don't want to have to write around something that's slightly off with the samples. So we have to find different ways of introducing that humanity back into the sounds. I would record something, turn it into a sample library, or a patch or whatever, and then using that to write changed the way that I was writing the music, but also changed the way that I then approached the next sample. So I guess that's the ultimate destination that you get to, where you're thinking about even the composing of the score as being part of a sample library development process.
What's one piece of advice that you rarely hear shared, but wish it was spoken about more?
So there's been some really useful advice, and actually some quotes from composers that I know that are in the book. The one person who says this repeatedly, and and I think this is great advice, and maybe people don't kind of get it really, is Hans Zimmer has said, you can't persuade somebody to like something. So the best course of action when somebody sits and tells you they don't like it is literally just to rip it up and start again. And we spend so much time trying to persuade people. I'll change that, I'll change this. And you waste loads of time. You risk ruining the relationship that you have with the director or the producers. I think that's kind of important.
To counteract that, on the other side of advice, What is the worst piece of advice you've ever heard confidently given, and what would you advise otherwise?
This is actually something that was both terrible advice and kind of good advice at the same time, but it is the most confidently possibly wrong piece of advice I've ever been given. And that advice was, and apologies if the person who gave me this advice is watching, but that advice was, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. You can write anything and the orchestra will make it sound good. And there's an element of that is right. Yes, anything will sound better when it's played by live players, but you can write something that sounds really, really bad, and the orchestra won't save you. It's just, so if you took that advice to heart, that's terrible, terrible advice. And you really need to study orchestration. What's the word? Is it autodidactically? If you can't, pay for an orchestration teacher, or you're not at college, or you haven't been to college, you learn it yourself. Just, get scores. It's so great. You can buy these incredible scores now, scores of How to Train Your Dragon. What an incredible score. And, you can buy the music and just sit and look at it and go, how's John done that? Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see. So it's all there.
Noted. Yeah. My last question. So you've given a lot of interviews, including this one. What's one question that you've never been asked but would love to answer? Unless you've been asked all the questions in the world at this point.
Nobody's ever asked me why I wanted to be a musician in the first place, or a composer/musician. And the answer is going back to my childhood. So I struggled, but managed to keep practicing the piano from the ages of 9 to 12, 13. I was effectively a professional musician, thrown into a world where you had to perform at an incredibly high level. And there was no, mistakes were horrific. So 3 years running, I sang the high C distant choir part in the Allegro Miserere. And it was I can still remember, it's actually just made all the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I can still remember the terror of doing that now. It was so frightening because I just knew that high C is, you've got maybe 50, 60% control over it. And sometimes it just goes. And if it went, it's exposed, everybody hears it, it was terrifying. So the super pressure, but the feel-good chemicals that you get from singing in a group of, extraordinarily highly performing singers and singing this incredible music as well all the time, was such a profound effect on me. By the time I'd been through all of those experiences, I couldn't imagine doing anything else.
Well, I'm glad you did.
Thank you.
That's all the questions I've got. So thank you.
It's been really interesting. Thank you. And you had some really good questions there. Some questions that I have never been asked before. So it's interesting thinking about all this stuff. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope that some absolutely fascinating questions that have really made me sit and think about things that some of that stuff will either be helpful to you in thinking about the way that you're approaching your career, or just be inspirational as well, because as rewarding as it is, this is a really hard job to do. And there are many hours when you sit staring at the screen thinking, I don't know if I can do this anymore. And so sometimes just little bits of inspiration that we find here and there can really help us push through that. So I hope there's some moments like that for you here.